Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look a little bit more at utilitarianism, and we're going to look at the thought of two philosophers, a little bit of Jon Stewart Mill and an even tinier bit of Henry Sidgwick, continuing our notion of utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist theory of ethics. Let's get into it. Now, while Jeremy Bentham might have been one of the original proponents of utilitarianism, probably the most well-known proponent of utilitarianism, who literally wrote a book called Utilitarianism, is Jon Stewart Mill, with a lot of significant input from his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, who is a robust utilitarian philosopher in her own right, despite the fact that she doesn't get as much credit as she should. Now, Mill is against the idea of act utilitarianism. He's a rule utilitarian. And so he says, yeah, when it comes to pleasure and pain, for human beings, for higher beings, some things are better than others. In fact, he goes as far as to say, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. So what Mill wants to do is say that utilitarianism here is not just raw hedonism. That's actually a kind of selfishness. This is not that. Mill wants to stress we're about doing what's best for everyone, not just what feels good to me in the moment. There might be things that are painful, which are actually ultimately best for us. Another aspect of Mill's utilitarianism is his libertarianism. Now, when I say libertarianism here, I don't mean libertarianism as in related to the Libertarian Party, but libertarianism in terms of the notion of freedom. In his On Liberty, he says, the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force, or the form of legal penalties, or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty or action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. What Mill is saying here is, in spite of everything that he said about utilitarianism, in spite of the fact that the greatest good for the greatest number, that consequences are more important than intentions, there's this mitigating principle. Someone's not doing what you want them to do. You can't change their mind. You can't force them. People ought to have freedom. The only time you ought to violate someone's freedom is if they're causing harm to others. Live and let live. Let people do what they're going to do. But if they're causing harm to others, that's when authority and force can step in and say, nope, you can't do that. He continues, his own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. You don't violate people's freedom for what's best for them. Going to, well, they need to learn a lesson. They need to do better than this. It's their duty to do so. Mill says, no. Let people do what they want to do. The only time you can step in with violence or force is when they're doing something that is harmful to others. Might be good reason. He says there are good reasons for remonstrating with him, that is correcting someone, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil, in case he do otherwise. To justify that, the conduct for which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. Only violate someone's right to freedom if they're harming someone else. The only part of conduct for anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence of right is absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. A person may cause evil to others not only by his actions, but by his inaction, and in either case, he is justly accountable to them for the injury. That's important. You can be held accountable not just for what you actually do, but by what you don't do. And so, Mill says, people don't want to play by this game. People want to do whatever they do. Let them. Until and unless they cause harm to others, or are causing harm to others. Do what's the best for most people. But you can't violate people's freedom unless and until they cause harm to others. Right now, I'm thinking of this situation. In a COVID-19 world, in your freedom, you say, I'm not going to wear a mask. You can do that if you want to. That's your right. You can behave how you want. But in that could cause harm to others. That's not right, and you don't get to make that decision. And other people can step in, including the state, with force to prevent your harm to others, because that is what's best for everyone. Otherwise, live and let live. Consider what he says here in On Liberty. The acts of an individual may be hurtful to others, or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going to the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may then be justly punished by opinion, though not by law. As soon as any part of the person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it. And the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to discussion. Yeah, you can do what you want to do, but as soon as it affects the community at large, it's not just a matter of your liberty anymore. Consider what he says here in On Liberty. The acts of an individual may be hurtful to others, or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going to the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may then be justly punished by opinion. That is, people might think bad thoughts about you, but you haven't done anything incriminating. That's fine, though not by law. As soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it. And the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to discussion. You want to do what you want to do and celebrate your liberty, that's fine. But as soon as it becomes a problem for other people, now it's not a matter of your liberty anymore, but has to do with the utility of all. So after Jon Stewart Mill, there's another thinker, Henry Sedgwick, who is considered also one of the major utilitarian philosophers as well. And what he does is he's able to succinctly define utilitarianism, and also in his book Methods of Ethics is able to compare utilitarianism to other kinds of ethical thought. And Sidwick is great for succinctly defining aspects of utilitarianism. Let's take a look. So Sidwick defines utilitarianism as follows. By utilitarianism is here meant the ethical theory that the conduct which, under any given circumstances, is objectively right is that which will produce the greatest amount of happiness on the whole. That is, taking into account all whose happiness is affected by the conduct. So listen to Henry Sidgwick's definition of utilitarianism. By utilitarianism is here meant the ethical theory that the conduct which, under any given circumstances, is objectively right is that which will produce the greatest amount of happiness on the whole. That is, taking into account all whose happiness is affected by the conduct. Following Mill's principle, it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and that's how Sidwick succinctly puts it here in his Methods of Ethics. Now, Sidwick also says, for utilitarianism is sometimes said to resolve all virtue into universal and impartial benevolence. It does not, however, prescribe that we should love all men equally, but that we should aim at happiness generally as our ultimate end, and so consider the happiness of any one individual as equally as important with the equal happiness of any other, as an element of this total, and should distribute our kindness so as to make this total as great as possible in whatever way this result may be attained. So for our purposes, that's it on utilitarianism. It's a consequentialist theory of ethics, which means the focus is on the consequences, as opposed to the focus being on the intent, which we're going to see next time when we talk about deontology. So again, utilitarianism, what does this produce? Is it best for everyone? The consequences are what's important, and that's how we determine what is right or what is wrong in ethics, according to utilitarianism.